The drone's claw closed around something warm in the dark. That was wrong. 9 hours adrift between the wreck and rescue should have left every surface cold enough to blister skin. One side of the black box was warm anyway, like it had been held. The salvage crew logged it without comment and sent it up the chain, because that was the job, and because none of them wanted to be the one who asked why. Inside the casing, 42 minutes of recorded footage from the bridge of the UNHS Mercy's Hand, a hospital ship, white hull, red cross, a name every species in the Treaty of Luren was supposed to recognize on sight. 42 minutes was all it took. By the time anyone finished watching, the shape of the known galaxy had already started to change. Admora took the file at her desk in Nairobi, long after midnight, the way she'd taken thousands of incident reports across 19 years at the UN Emergency Coordination Center. She pressed play expecting a border skirmish. Ships clipped each other out on the drift sometimes. Paperwork followed. She had a form ready before she even opened the folder. She did not finish the form. Her jaw locked halfway through minute 6, hard enough that the tendons stood out along her neck. By minute 20, she had stopped taking notes. By minute 35, her hand was already on the strap of her bag, though she wouldn't notice she'd done that until later. She watched a hospital ship take a first shot with its transponder broadcasting medical vessel, and no reply came back to that broadcast at any point in the whole 42 minutes. Not a warning, not a hail, not even a lie. She did not finish watching. She picked up the phone instead. What happens on the rest of that footage stays with her, for now. What happens next doesn't wait. You want to believe hospitals are safe out there. Keep listening. That belief is about to break. 6 days earlier, the gloves had still been white. Dr. Rael Ian was in the lower deck prepping surgical tools. The gloves were white. They were still clean. He'd laid out 4 trays for the morning rotation and was checking suture kits against a manifest when Caladrant, 26, 3 months out of training, leaned into the doorway to complain that the coffee synth was down again. It was a small complaint. It was the kind of complaint people make on ordinary days. Ian told her to file it with maintenance and went back to counting sutures. The Mercy's Hand had filed its flight path with Conclave Border Authority a full cycle in advance, the way it always did, the way the treaty required. 89 crew moved through the ship that morning sorting blood substitute and bone repair gel, running the kind of quiet, competent tasks that never make it into any report. A conclave patrol crossed their scope, the standard hailing distance. Everyone on the bridge assumed it was routine. The patrol had flown this corridor a dozen times. They knew what the ship was. They'd signed the same treaty. No warning, no hail, no answer to the transponder. The first shot hit the port cargo bay, and the whole deck tilted sideways. Ian went into a bulkhead hard enough to crack 3 ribs and didn't fully register the pain until later, because the hull had opened a meter from where Caladrant was standing, and the air in the corridor was already trying to leave through the gap. He got a patch kit off the wall bracket with hands that weren't steady and pressed it into the breach anyway, holding it there with his palms, while the emergency sealant cured, 3 cracked ribs grinding with every breath. Caladrant grabbed a second kit without being told and started on the smaller tier beside his. Neither of them said anything worth repeating. There wasn't time. For the next 11 hours, Ian moved through smoke and screaming and did the only thing he knew how to do, which was keep working. He didn't stop to process what had happened. He stopped enough times to be sick once, standing over a sink, and then he went back out. Somewhere in the second hour he registered, distantly, that the attacking ship hadn't left. It sat off the Mercy's Hand's flank for a long while after the first shot, running no further fire, doing nothing but holding position. Nobody on the medical deck had time to wonder why. That question went into a drawer in the back of Ian's mind and stayed there. Yusuf, a radio operator who liked to hum old broadcast jingles under his breath while he worked, didn't make it past the second hour. Ian was the one who confirmed it, because someone had to, and because writing a name on a manifest was a smaller kind of impossible than everything else that day. 89 of the crew died before rescue reached them. 191 survived, and most of the reason for that number was a man who would not stop moving even after his own ribs told him to. The gloves were not white anymore by hour 3. Ian kept wearing the same pair through hour 11 because changing them cost time he didn't have, and because by then it hardly seemed to matter what color they were. Back in Nairobi, Admora didn't call her supervisor. She called the Secretary General directly, which she had never done in 19 years on the job, not once, not for anything. "You need to see this," she said, and nothing else, because nothing else needed saying. Within 24 hours, the footage was on every human screen that could receive a broadcast. People who had never thought about the drift, or the conclave, or a hospital ship called the Mercy's Hand, sat in kitchens and transit stations and watched 42 minutes of a patrol that knew exactly what it was firing on. Somewhere in that same window, on a border world most humans couldn't have located on a star chart, a Divari communications officer watched the same footage on a private feed and said nothing to anyone for a long time. That reaction wouldn't matter to Earth for weeks yet. It would matter eventually. Admora went home before dawn and hugged her children without explaining why, and did not sleep, and did not need to ask herself whether anything would be the same after this. She already knew the answer. So did the rest of the galaxy. It just didn't know it yet. Director Hana Real stood before the War Council in a room that had approved troop deployments, trade sanctions, and disaster relief without anyone raising their voice. Nobody raised their voice now either. That was the strange part. She'd expected shouting. Instead, she got a silence so complete she could hear the building's climate system ticking behind the walls. "They shot our doctors," she said. 4 words. She didn't add anything to them because nothing needed adding. The vote came back unanimous within the hour. Surrender the officers responsible, pay reparations to the families of the 89, grant humanity, a permanent humanitarian corridor through the drift with no conclave inspection rights. Real's deputy, a quiet man named Faris who rarely spoke in these sessions, was the one who wrote the final draft. He kept it short. 3 demands, no threats, no ultimatum language beyond the demands themselves. Real read it twice and didn't change a word. "Simple enough that no one can pretend they misunderstood it," she said. She was wrong about that, though she wouldn't learn how wrong for another 11 days. Grand Executive Draveth Corveth read the ultimatum once in his private chambers on the conclave capital, standing beneath a window that looked out over a skyline 4,000 years older than the entire span of human civilization. His skin held a pale blue undertone, and the bioluminescent ridges along his throat pulsed faintly as he read, a physical tell he'd never learned to suppress, because in 4,000 years no one had ever needed him to. He set the page down on the table without comment. "Draft a counteroffer," he told the aide waiting by the door. "Concede nothing." Preth, his senior advisor, had served 3 of Corveth's predecessors and had learned when to speak and when not to. He spoke now anyway. "Grand Executive, perhaps this species should be taken seriously." "What exactly are they going to do?" Corveth didn't look up from the next document on his desk. "They have been in space 200 years. We have held this coalition together for 4,000. Draft the counteroffer." Preth left without another word. He would remember this exchange later, in a cell, with considerably more time to think about it than he wanted. Ambassador Rule sent his message through a private diplomatic channel 11 hours after the counteroffer went out, addressed directly to Corveth and marked for his eyes only. It read in full, "Accept the terms. All of them. Do it now. You do not understand what you are looking at." The message was logged, filed, and never answered. Corveth's staff assumed Rule was being cautious, the way old diplomats often were. Rule wasn't being cautious. He had spent 6 years posted near human space, and he'd watched them build things, hospitals, relief convoys, entire orbital shipyards, in timeframes the Conclave's own engineers called impossible. He knew what a species like that could do with an insult this specific. Nobody at the capital asked him to explain further. He didn't send a second message. There didn't seem to be a point. 72 hours passed with no response of any kind from the conclave. Not a counteroffer, not an acknowledgement, nothing. Admora tracked the silence from her desk in Nairobi the way she tracked everything, in careful increments logged to the minute. She went home each night and hugged her children a little longer than usual and still didn't explain why, because there wasn't a way to explain it that wouldn't frighten them. On the fourth night, her older daughter asked if something bad was going to happen. Mora told her the truth mostly. Something's already happened. We're deciding what to do about it. 72 hours of silence sounds like nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was the exact amount of time humanity needed. On the farming moon of Series 4, 600 workers who grew grain for 11 settled colonies held a vote in a converted grain silo and retooled the entire operation to hull plate fabrication in 6 days. Nobody waited for a government directive. Approval came through by dawn the next morning, and the heavy equipment was already being moved before the paperwork caught up to it. A woman named Ilana Voss, who had spent 14 years running the silo's grain sorters, spent her first shift on the new line burning her hand on a plating press and going straight back to work with it wrapped. She didn't know Rael's name. She wouldn't have recognized it if she'd heard it. She was doing the same thing he had done, in a different building, for a different reason that turned out to be the same reason. Admiral Daria Solano received her war commission through a standard communicator ping while she was in the middle of reviewing a supply manifest, and read it twice before she said anything to the aide standing beside her. Then she cancelled all shore leave across 3 carrier groups with a single order and sent her officers one line to pass down the chain. Pack like you mean it. She crossed the border in 29 days. The Conclave's own military doctrine, 4,000 years deep, had assumed any human mobilization at that scale would take 18 months at minimum, the time it had always taken every species they'd ever measured. Nobody at the capital had updated that assumption since the treaty was signed. Nobody thought they needed to. Solano's 3 carrier groups, 2 logistics chains, and a real-time sensor network that let every ship in the formation see what every other ship saw cross the drift in less time than it took the Conclave to finish drafting a formal response to the original ultimatum. Corveth learned about the crossing from a junior officer who delivered the report standing at a distance he clearly hoped was far enough. The throat ridges pulsed hard enough to be visible from across the room. 29 days, Corveth said, very quietly, and for the first time since the ultimatum arrived, he didn't have an answer ready. The battle at the edge of the drift began 4 hours later and lasted 4 hours exactly. It wasn't close. The Conclave patrol ships that had been stationed there to enforce the same border they'd violated with the Mercy's hand lost 9 vessels. Humanity lost 2. Solano stood on the bridge of her flagship through all 4 hours without sitting down once, watching a tactical display that told her, in real time, exactly how badly the Conclave's assumptions had aged. When it was over, she didn't order a pursuit. She ordered something else instead, a translation array built from 3 commandeered relay stations set to broadcast one continuous signal into every corner of Conclave space it could reach. The signal was 42 minutes long. It looped without pause. Half those species in that coalition, Solano told her communications officer, had no idea their own grand executive was going to do this. I want them to know exactly what their flag was used for, every hour on repeat until somebody makes him stop it. Nobody made him stop it. That was the problem. And somewhere out past the edge of that broadcast range, a Divari communications officer who had already watched the footage once, alone on a private feed, watched it again, this time on a public channel, with colleagues in the room, and said nothing out loud. He filed a formal protest through official channels the next morning. It went nowhere. He filed it again, word for word, and sent a copy directly to his own species' independent news networks instead of waiting for anyone's permission. That was the first crack. It wouldn't be the last. Sergeant Voss Harlon's strike team hit the communications relay at Bait Station in 11 minutes, start to finish, using a pulse weapon his engineers had built from spare parts during the crossing itself. Nobody back home had approved the design. There hadn't been time to ask. The relay went dark mid-transmission, cutting off a conclave communications burst before it finished sending. Harlon didn't know what was in that burst. He didn't need to. Knocking it out was the job. Clean, he told his team over the comm, already moving toward the extraction point. Nobody even got a shot off at us. That wasn't quite true of the next objective. The Dreth 6 facility chain sat on a contested moon that both sides had quietly agreed not to fight over for years, which made it exactly the kind of place Solano wanted secured before the Conclave thought to defend it properly. Harlon's unit went in through a maintenance tunnel nobody on either side had used in a decade and took the whole chain in 3 hours without firing a single round. The garrison inside had already heard about Bait Station. They'd heard about the battle at the Drift. Mostly, they'd heard the translation arrays 42 minutes on a loop for 6 straight days, and by the time Harlon's team reached the command level, half the garrison had already stopped believing anyone was coming to explain it away. A young conclave officer met him at the final checkpoint with his hands already raised, before Harlon had said a word. "You're not going to shoot us," the officer said. It wasn't a question. He was Vari, grey-skinned, young enough that his voice still cracked slightly on the last word. "No," Harlon said. "Sit down. Nobody else has to get hurt today." The officer sat. He kept looking at Harlon's face the rest of the afternoon, like he was trying to work out how a species barely 200 years off their homeworld had done all of this in under a month. Harlon didn't have an answer for him either. He wasn't sure anyone did yet. Word of Dreth 6 reached Fleet Admiral Sarath before it reached Corveth, because Sarath's staff had learned, in the last 2 weeks, to bring him bad news first and official channels second. Sarath had commanded conclave forces for longer than most of his officers had been alive, and in that whole span, he had never once seen a garrison surrender before a shot was fired. He sat with that fact for a long while in his private quarters, turning a data slate over in his hands without reading anything on it, the kind of small useless motion a man does when he already knows what he's about to do and is only waiting to admit it to himself. Humans do not appear to be seeking a balance, he wrote in his private log that night, alone. They appear to be seeking a conclusion. He didn't send that line to anyone, not yet. What he did send, 3 days later, was everything. Sarath transmitted the original firing order for the Mercy's Hand attack directly to Admiral Solano through his own private channel. The signed authorization, Corveth's own name on it, along with the internal council debate minutes, and a full list of every official who had approved the patrol's rules of engagement before the ship was ever fired on. It was the one piece of proof that made the Grand Executive's public denials impossible to sustain. Sarath attached 4 words to the transmission and nothing else. "I will not defend contempt." Admora was at her desk in Nairobi when the documents came through official diplomatic channels an hour later, forwarded from Riel's office with a single line of context, verified, authentic, releasing within the day. Mora read it twice, the way she'd read the ultimatum weeks before, and found she wasn't surprised. She'd stopped being surprised somewhere around the 4th sleepless night. She made herself a cup of tea she didn't finish and went back to work, because that was still the job, even now. Back on the Capitol, Corveth learned about the leak the same way he'd learned about the crossing, from a junior officer standing at a careful distance, throat ridges already pulsing, before the man finished his first sentence. Corveth read the transmission himself this time, his own signature, his own name, time-stamped, on an order he had spent weeks publicly calling a border skirmish. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he told the officer to leave the room. Preth found him an hour later, still standing at the window, the document still open on the desk behind him. It was the same window from which Corveth had watched the skyline 4,000 years in the making and told his advisor that humans couldn't possibly do anything worth worrying about. Preth didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. His silence did the job better than words would have. The Divari delegation withdrew from the conclave within 16 hours of the documents going public, citing, in a formal statement, conduct incompatible with the founding principles of the coalition. The Vari followed less than a day later, citing their own cargo ship that had been fired on 8 months earlier under circumstances that suddenly looked a great deal less accidental. The Chilith withdrew last and took their intelligence archives with them when they left, a detail that would matter a great deal to what came next. 3 species, 16 hours, and then a little more, and then it was done. Riel's office had sent the documents to all 3 governments with a single cover note, no threats attached, no demands beyond the ones already on the table. She hadn't needed to add anything. The proof did the rest. Ambassador Rule, watching the withdrawals from his own quiet post near human space, allowed himself something that might have been the first real relief he'd felt in weeks. He told them to accept the terms before any of this became necessary. Nobody had listened. He didn't send an "I told you so" either. There didn't seem to be any satisfaction in being right about something this costly. Corveth's own remaining council convened without summoning him. He found out about the meeting only when 2 of his own security officers came to his chambers, not to escort him anywhere in particular, but simply to stand at the door and wait, the way people wait when they already know how something ends and are only being polite about the timing. Corveth looked at them both for a long moment. The throat ridges had stopped pulsing entirely. That was, in its own way, worse than the pulsing had been. 4,000 years, he said, to no one in particular. Neither officer answered him. There wasn't an answer that would have helped. The security officers did not draw weapons. They didn't need to. Corveth walked out of his own chambers between them without being told to move, because there was nowhere left to walk that wasn't already decided for him. The council that convened without him formalized what everyone already knew by the time he reached the holding level. Arrested by his own remaining government on charges his own signature had already proven. Fleet Admiral Sarath surrendered through the same private channel he'd used to send the firing order, addressed to Solano directly. 2 lines, nothing more. The garrison stands down. I stand down with it. Solano read it standing on her bridge, the same place she'd stood through the 4-hour battle, and didn't feel anything like triumph. She felt tired, mostly, in a way that had been building for 29 days and hadn't found anywhere to land until now. At Dreth 6, the last of the garrison walked out of the command level with their hands raised, the way the young Vari officer had raised his 3 hours into Harlon's assault. Harlon stood at the tunnel mouth and counted them as they came, out loud, under his breath, the way he'd counted patients once, a long time ago, in a different life he didn't talk about much. 41. 42. He stopped counting out loud somewhere past 50 and just watched the rest file past. The Treaty of the Mercy Corridor was signed 4 days later, in the old Geneva Hall, on the same wooden floor that had hosted the signing of every human peace agreement for 2 centuries. The preamble came first, before a single article of the treaty itself, 89 names, in alphabetical order, read aloud by a clerk whose voice didn't waver once through all of them. Faris had insisted on that order. The Vari delegation, present to sign on behalf of what remained of the coalition, agreed without argument. Nobody suggested trimming the list for time. The reading took most of an hour on its own. Director Hana Riel stood through all of it. She'd stood through the ultimatum vote the same way, the same posture, the same stillness. Somewhere around name 60, she reached into her coat pocket and found nothing there, because she'd left her tea back at the office that morning without drinking it, the way she'd left most cups of tea untouched for weeks now. It didn't matter. She wasn't thirsty. She was listening. Afterward, alone in the old conference hall, she stood at the tall window while the treaty pages were carried out for filing. Rain had started somewhere in the last hour, ordinary rain, running down glass that was older than the coalition that had just collapsed on the other side of it. 89 photographs hung on a wall back in Nairobi, faces on plain paper, no labels, the ones nobody had taken down since the footage first aired. Riel walked past that wall every morning on her way into the building. She never stopped walking when she passed it. She never looked away from it either. This was not diplomacy, she thought, watching the rain instead of the door. This was a confession, dressed up as a treaty, because the people confessing needed somewhere formal to put it. The war had not been won on the day of the battle at the Drift, or the day the translation array went live, or even the day Sarath's documents broke the coalition apart. It had been one earlier than any of that, quietly, the moment someone decided the names mattered more than the count of them. She hadn't raised her voice once through any of it. She didn't feel the need to raise it now. The Mercy corridor opened 3 weeks after the signing, a joint patrol lane through the drift, free passage. No permission required from either side. The first shared infrastructure the two powers had built since the war began. The first ship to pass through it was the UNHS Mercy's Hand, III, white hull, red cross, escorted on both flanks by ships flying flags that had been shooting at humans a season earlier. Nobody spoke over the comm during the crossing. There didn't seem to be anything that needed saying out loud. Dr. Rail Ian gave the memorial address at the edge of the drift, on a small platform built for the occasion, facing a crowd that included medical staff, fleet officers, and 3 representatives from species that had once belonged to a coalition that no longer existed. He didn't speak long. 89 people came out here to help strangers they had never met, he said. They went because that's what you do. Someone decided that was a good target. He paused, not for effect, just because the next part was harder to say than the first. I do the same work every day still. That's how I honor them, not with anger, not with forgiveness either, just with the work. He folded his notes. He walked back from the podium. Nobody clapped. That felt right. Sergeant Voss Harlon watched the broadcast from a rehab facility in Auckland, his knee propped on a cushion that hadn't done much good in the weeks since Dreth 6. He thought, watching Ian fold his notes, about the young Vari officer who'd raised his hands before a shot was fired, who'd looked at Harlon like he was trying to work out how a species barely 200 years off its homeworld had managed all of this in under a month. Harlon never learned what became of that officer after the surrender processing. He found himself hoping, in a vague way he didn't examine too closely, that it had gone all right for him. Ambassador Rule watched the same broadcast from his post near human space, the one he'd held through all of it, and thought about the message he'd sent that no one had answered. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt, mostly, like a man who'd watched something break that he'd tried once to stop and hadn't managed to. When the rescue team had first pulled Ian out through the emergency hatch of the Mercy's Hand, all those weeks ago, he had still been wearing his surgical gloves. They were not white anymore. He'd sat down on the floor of the airlock and stayed there a long time, eyes open, looking at nothing, hands still gloved, because taking them off had felt, in that moment, like admitting the day was over. On the platform at the memorial, long after the crowd had gone, Ian took the gloves off for the first time in the retelling anyone would ever hear about. He didn't make a show of it. He folded them once, set them in his coat pocket, and looked out at the empty drift for a while before he turned and walked back toward the ship waiting to take him home. The rain in Geneva had stopped by then. Somewhere over the drift, the Mercy's Hand III kept sailing, quiet, unescorted now, its white hull catching what light there was.